Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez is at it again. First, she was crying and emotional about the events in the Capitol. She was voted as Best Actor by Fox News. But in addition, she just made a huge gaffe, a huge mistake. And that was saying that there are no guns in DC. She said that guns are illegal in the District of Columbia. Well, if she knew anything about the law, anything about the Second Amendment, or anything about the huge case DC versus Heller, she would know that firearms are in fact constitutionally protected and legal in the District of Columbia. I'm Andrew Esquire, and this is the Legal Mindset, where we use the law to give you an unfair advantage. And today we are going to be talking about the Second Amendment, the big two, breaking down what it is and some of the insane laws that are being passed to curb Second Amendment rights. So stick around to the end to hear all of them and exactly where they're going. So let's start with some fundamentals about the Second Amendment. What is the Second Amendment? The Second Amendment is relatively straightforward. It's a very short phrase, and it simply says, a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That first portion of the statement about the well-regulated militia being necessary, that is what's called a prefatory phase. Sometimes in law, you see these whereas clauses in contracts. They're essentially reasons why you're enacting a particular law or entering into a particular agreement. For example, I might say, whereas I need a hamburger, I am entering into a contract with McDonald's to give me one Big Mac. Well, the reason was I need a hamburger, but the function was the Big Mac. I'm going to give them money and they're going to give me the Big Mac. That's the same way the Second Amendment operates. And this is something that AOC doesn't understand, that the core, the functional part of the Second Amendment, as reinforced by courts, is that the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So just remember that is the core language of the Second Amendment. Now, let's go on to talk about some of the crazy laws that have been proposed by Democrats and Joe Biden this coming election season and that are coming up in the legislative process. Now, there are various ways in which gun laws are regulated, but there's three major types of regulations. Let's start with the first. The first is a national registry. That is a list of all the people who own or purchase guns. This has been something that gun advocates, gun rights groups have been fighting for a long time. The NRA has always been opposed to this. And current legislation, at least how it's proposed, would make a national registry of gun owners that would be easily searchable via the internet and tell you exactly where their guns are, exactly how many they bought, and their names. Think about that. Who they are, how many guns they have, and exactly where those guns are. That's a lot of data. Now let's leave aside the fact that collecting that data would be extremely difficult, especially for the guns that have already been purchased. Now, what are some of the glaring issues with a national gun registry, one that's easily searchable in the way that AOC and Democrats want? Well, the issue is crime. Crime is a huge factor with a national gun registry. Now, believe it or not, most criminals don't use legal guns. They don't go to the local gun shop and pay Bob the gun store owner for that gun. They're using an unregistered or stolen weapon. So if they had a list of weapons online, a list of who owns weapons, it could use it as their shop. Find somebody nearby who owns a lot of guns and go rob them, go steal from them when they're not home. Break in, take those guns, and now they've got guns. Huge problem. Another problem is police officers and former police officers. The legislation as proposed by Democrats doesn't carve out exceptions for law enforcement or former judges. So let's say you're a criminal and you really didn't like the officer or judge who put you in jail, and now you're out. Well, you just hop online, look up who's got guns, and you're probably gonna find a lot of police officers, law enforcement, and perhaps judges, and exactly where they live. And being able to track those people down is a huge risk and will lead to a spike in retributive crime. It'll also lead to cops and judges not wanting to perform their jobs because they're afraid that they might be persecuted by those criminals. Another concern is that registration often leads to licensing requirements. We saw this in countries like Australia, which has banned weapons. They started with registration, then followed up with licensing requirements, which eventually led to a complete ban and confiscation of weapons. We've also seen this in many authoritarian regimes throughout the years. Notoriously, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany both confiscated weapons. And that's one of the key concerns for folks when they think about this in the context of the Second Amendment and the freedoms that were intended to be enshrined by the founders. The next step and the next thing that's in the pipeline, which is extraordinarily concerning, is red flag laws. Now, I know your mom always told you, avoid those girls and boys with the red flags, stay away. This isn't dating, guys. This is guns. Now, what does red flags mean in the context of guns? Well, red flag laws have been passed in 19 states, and half a dozen more are considering red flag measures. But what is a red flag? A red flag is any risky behavior, okay? Now, who is spotting this risky behavior? Who is saying that someone is exhibiting risky behavior? Well, it could be law enforcement, it could be coworkers, employers, like in California with their red flag law, family members, or anybody living with that person. It can even be people who know that person, or let's say an ex-girlfriend who's just mad at you. All they have to do under a red flag law is say you are risky. Your behavior is risky and could be a danger to others or yourself, and that you own guns. And that can send it to a hearing, before a judge. And if that judge determines in their sole discretion that you should not have guns, they're able to take your weapons away. Now, I know that sounds crazy, but that's how those laws function. Once the court has ruled that your guns should be taken from you, do they have to give them back after a certain period? No. In fact, once they've taken them from you, you are guilty until proven innocent. Until you prove that you are no longer a risk, those guns can be withheld from you. Sometimes they can hold them under the initial order for as long as a year. So you might have to wait a year before another hearing to come up and try to get those guns back. And even then, it's no guarantee that you actually will be able to get them back. The court could essentially indefinitely take away your ability to own weapons. And what is the logic behind this? What is the thought behind this? Because we know it's not crime. Like I said, most criminals are using stolen weapons. So why use this red flag law? Why does an employer or a girlfriend or a coworker have the right to say, hey, take that guy's guns away? Well, suicide was cited as the major justification for this. Often when people commit suicide, they use a gun. Now, people also commit suicide by other methods, drowning, knives, etc. But guns are a major method of suicide. The problem is that taking away the guns does not resolve the underlying drive to suicide. That's like saying, I'm gonna give you an Advil to cure your headache, but not address the fact that you have pneumonia and try to cure that. You're not looking at the symptoms. Oftentimes, people are driven to suicide because of social isolation, because of poor financial situations, such as during this pandemic, and other chronic mental health issues, including things that can be driven by poor lifestyle. Addressing all of those things will be a holistic solution to remedy suicide. But instead, the justification is to completely take away those weapons. It's not a one-to-one in terms of the reason. And furthermore, these things can be pushed beyond just coworkers or other people saying that they're a risk to yourself or others. There also can be pushed at a broader federal level. Now, I know back in the day, and I was around for George Bush, wasn't a lawyer then, but I was around then when people were really worried about people being called terrorists, when pretty much anybody who said anything bad about America was considered a terrorist. And we first invented the word domestic terrorist. That is somebody who is a terrorist at home. Now, Vice President Kamala Harris actually proposed legislation, particularly when she was campaigning, to allow guns to be taken away from suspected domestic terrorists or suspected white nationalists. Now, you can obviously see how this could go down a slippery slope into regulating free speech. And if you want to see more about how free speech is in danger, check out my video on free speech. But the real issue is that this could escalate into widespread confiscation of weapons, which is a slippery slope and once again, violating the spirit of the Second Amendment. So let's get into the third reason, which is banning specific types of weapons. This is essentially what is known by most people as an assault weapons ban, right? So, I mean, look, when I hear that, and look, I'm an intelligent lawyer, I think assault weapon. Immediately, I think machine gun. I think something that's automatic firing, used by the military. Well, spoiler alert, those have never been legal. At no point in the US history have military-grade weapons been legal to own for personal self-defense use by common man. We were not using cannons and such in our homes. Those have always been prohibited, even back in the colonial days. So what are we talking about? Essentially, we're talking about weapons that look scary. We're talking about weapons that are like the AK-47 type weapons. Now, just looking like this weapon, which is so ingrained in your mind as to being a weapon of war, you don't think, what is the actual capability of this weapon? What can it do? And that's something that people like AOC are just not thinking about. First of all, they're not aware of the basics of the law, but they don't understand the functions of these weapons. Let's take the AR-15. The AR-15 is perhaps the most ubiquitous rifle in America. Almost everybody knows what an AR-15 is. Now, it may look scary, but fun fact, it often has a lower muzzle velocity and much lower range than a standard hunting rifle. Now, when I grew up, I went hunting with my dad and my uncle, and some of those rifles I used could hit deer a huge distance away, a crazy distance away, much more powerful than an AR-15. But that's something that gun control advocates like AOC just don't understand. They're not looking at how powerful the gun is. They're creating a list of guns specifically that should be banned because they look military-like. And that's the real issue. And there were other issues, particularly regarding the law around weapons that we saw coming after the election of Joe Biden. To see that, check out my video, Biden's Big Changes.